The arena had been constructed inside the Coalition's neutral observation platform, with the particular thoroughness of an empire that understood demonstration as diplomacy. Kralais Verath's engineers had arrived 6 hours before the scheduled presentation and converted a standard cargo bay into something that communicated power before a single living thing entered it. Reinforced walls carrying the deep scoring of previous encounters, lighting calibrated to the beast's optimal hunting spectrum rather than observer comfort, the air carrying a controlled chemical composition that the handling team had introduced to prime the creature's aggression response to precisely the level the Queen considered most illustrative. Not maximum aggression was for battlefields. This was maximum controlled aggression, which was its own kind of statement. It said, "We can do worse than this, and we choose not to, and that choice is itself the demonstration of strength." Corvin Ash had taken a seat in the third row of the observer section and opened his notepad. He was, by the Coalition's attendance roster, listed as Senior Xenobiological Assessment Consultant, which was accurate in the way that job titles were accurate when they described the formal category of a thing without conveying its texture. He had spent 14 years assessing non-human biological systems across 23 catalogued worlds, and he had the quality that came from that kind of work. A stillness that was not passivity, but the accumulated habit of someone who had learned that the most important data arrived before you started looking for it. He had noted the lighting calibration when he entered. He had noted the chemical composition of the air, or as much of it as his baseline senses could approximate. He had noted the scoring on the walls and the depth and pattern of it, and what that pattern suggested about reach and preferred strike angle. He took notes on all of this in the small, dense handwriting of someone who had never trusted digital records with first impressions. Kralais Verath stood at the presentation platform with the composed authority of a sovereign who had given this particular demonstration before and knew its effect. She was tall by her species standard, which made her tall by most standards, with the characteristic dorsal ridge structure of the Varethian ruling class, and eyes that processed light in 4 spectral bands, 2 of which were outside human range. The Coalition's xenobiological briefing had covered this. It had also covered the political context. The Empire had been at the Coalition's borders for 30 years, neither at war nor at peace, and these demonstrations were part of an ongoing negotiation about which condition was preferable and who had more to lose from the answer. The presentation had begun with tactical footage. 30 years of arena records and 3 battlefield deployments, compiled into a sequence that moved from impressive to something that required recalibrating what impressive meant. The beast designated subject Orath in the Empire's records, though the handling team referred to it by a Varethian term that translated approximately as the one that ends things, had never lost. This was not hyperbole for diplomatic purposes. The records showed no defeat, no draw, no engagement that had not terminated in the beast's complete victory. It had fought creatures twice its mass. It had continued operating through wound loads that the Varethian medical team's post-engagement analyses rated as theoretically non-survivable. It had, on one recorded occasion, fought for 11 continuous hours against rotating opponents in a battlefield scenario, and the footage of the 11th hour was operationally indistinguishable from the first. "The Empire does not produce retreat," Kralais Verath said, with the tone of someone stating a physical law. "We produce completion. Every engagement ends. This is the philosophy of Orath, and it is the philosophy of the Varethian people." Corvin wrote, "Completion as cultural value. Note asymmetry between tactical flexibility and doctrinal rigidity." He had developed, over 14 years, the habit of noting things he found interesting without immediately deciding why he found them interesting. The note about asymmetry fell into this category. He would examine it later, or he wouldn't, but it existed now in the record. The handling team entered the arena space through the reinforced side access, and the beast came with them. It was, Corvin observed, exactly what the briefing materials had described, and also nothing like what the briefing materials had described, which was the reliable experience of encountering something that had only previously existed as data. Orath was 4 meters at the shoulder, moving with the fluid precision of something that had never learned to move any other way, the musculature beneath the scaled exterior doing the quiet continuous work of a body designed entirely around one purpose. The handlers maintained their positions through a system of channeled aggression, not controlling the beast so much as directing the pressure of it, the way you could redirect a current without stopping it. The control system readouts on the handler's equipment were visible from the observer section. Green across all indicators, aggression channeled, behavioral protocols nominal. The creature's head moved through the space in the slow, methodical sweep of something assessing everything. It did not look at the observers the way animals looked at things. It looked at them the way a weapons system looked at targets, cataloging, calculating, filing. When its gaze passed over the third row, Corvin looked back at it without particular expression and wrote something in his notepad. The demonstration proceeded through 4 scenarios, each calibrated to display a different aspect of Orath's capability. In the first, the beast was presented with a simulated obstacle course, representing the architecture of a defended position. It moved through in 40 seconds, and the scoring it left in the reinforced materials suggested the obstacles had been structural before the encounter and were decorative afterward. In the second, it faced 3 drone systems running active evasion protocols, and the engagement lasted less than 90 seconds, and at the end of 90 seconds the drone systems were no longer running any protocols. In the third, it was presented with a chemical deterrent scenario. The handlers introduced compounds used by 17 coalition species as apex predator repellents, concentrations at triple their standard application strength. Orath walked through the chemical environment without behavioral modification, which the Varethian xenobiological team annotated on the shared display as deterrent threshold, not identified. The fourth scenario was the human observer. Coalition representatives are invited, Kralais Verath said, with the composed confidence of someone extending an invitation they expected to be declined, to experience the Empire's strength firsthand, to stand in the presence of what we have made and understand its nature. This invitation, Corvin knew from the briefing materials, had been extended at previous demonstrations to 26 coalition representatives across 14 species. All 26 had declined. This was not recorded as cowardice in the diplomatic record. It was recorded as rational assessment, which it was, and no one had criticized the assessments. The invitation existed to make a point, not to be accepted. He closed his notepad. He stood up. The observer section made a sound that was not quite silence and not quite anything else, the collective atmospheric shift of a group of people revising their expectations simultaneously. Kralais Verath looked at him with an expression that moved through surprise and arrived at something that might have been appreciation for the performance value of the gesture, which she clearly expected to last approximately as long as it took him to reach the arena floor and reconsider. He reached the arena floor and did not reconsider. The handling team made adjustments. The control system indicators shifted from green into the range that indicated active engagement protocols, not release, but readiness. The system prepared to direct the aggression that was about to have a clear target. Orath's head had already found him. The cataloging gaze was doing something different now, the slow, methodical sweep replaced by fixed attention, and even from the distance of the arena floor, Corvin could see the quality of that attention change. He stopped walking at approximately the center of the space, and stood with his hands at his sides, and his weight evenly distributed, and his breathing at its resting rate, which was a thing he had practiced for years. in the presence of large biological systems that responded to physiological stress signals. The handlers released the directional constraint. Orath moved. It moved with the efficiency of something that had done this particular motion 10,000 times. Forward, direct. The predatory confidence of an apex system that had never encountered a forward motion that didn't resolve in its favor. The arena was 40 meters across. It covered 37 of them in the time it took the observer section to collectively inhale. At 3 meters it stopped, not slowed, not hesitated. Stopped the full cessation of forward movement, all 4 meters of it, with the abruptness of a system receiving a command that overrode everything else currently running. The handler's control systems alarmed immediately. Because the control systems were designed to alarm when the biological inputs they monitored produced readings outside the cataloged parameters of the beast's behavioral profile. And what they were receiving now was outside those parameters in a direction the systems had no category for. The retreat indicator, which existed in the control system's architecture as a theoretical marker for a condition that had never been recorded, activated. Orath took one step back. The observer section made no sound at all. The xenobiological analysis team worked for 4 hours, which was, Corvin noted from his returned position in the 3rd row, admirably fast for the complexity of what they were trying to determine. He had resumed his notepad. He had added several observations about the encounter that he considered professionally interesting. He had accepted the cup of something warm that a coalition aide had brought him with the slightly stunned solicitude of someone who had watched him do a thing they were still processing and needed to express their reaction through beverage service. Kralice Verath had not spoken since the retreat. This was, her protocol staff's expressions suggested, unprecedented in a different register than the retreat itself. The Queen processed setbacks through speech, through the immediate reframing of disadvantage into strategic position, through the Varethian rhetorical tradition of never allowing a silence to become the loudest thing in the room. She was sitting in the silence. She was, Corvin observed, looking at him with an expression that had cycled through several phases and arrived at something that was genuinely, without diplomatic performance, trying to understand. The lead xenobiologist delivered the analysis findings at the 4-hour mark, to the Queen and the assembled observers simultaneously, with the careful delivery of someone presenting conclusions they had checked 3 times, because the conclusions were not what anyone had been expecting to find. The threat assessment biology, the deep evolutionary system that Orath's designers had enhanced and refined over 3 decades of genetic work, the mechanism that allowed it to evaluate danger and respond with precisely calibrated aggression, had not malfunctioned. It had operated exactly as designed. The step back was not a system failure. It was a system output. The human's biochemical signature, combined with the postural and micro-movement profile his body produced at rest, had registered in the threat assessment biology as a specific classification. Not prey, not obstacle, not equivalent predator, the category that triggered the overwhelming aggression response. The classification the system had returned, drawing on the millions of years of evolutionary predator instinct that the genetic engineers had amplified rather than replaced, was a category that existed in the beast's biological inheritance from long before its enhancement. A category that said, this thing is not prey and not equal and not something aggression resolves. This thing eats predators. This thing is what predators learn across geological time to avoid. Humans, the lead xenobiologist said, with the tone of someone delivering a finding that was going to require considerable follow-up work, smelled like Deathworld apex survivors to biological systems whose threat assessment instincts were still functionally connected to their evolutionary substrate. Not to all biological systems, only to those whose instincts were intact rather than overridden. Orath's designers had kept the instincts because the instincts made it better at what it did. They had not anticipated that keeping the instincts meant keeping the responses the instincts produced. including the response to the particular biochemical and behavioral signature of something that had survived across hundreds of thousands of years by being the most dangerous thing in every environment it had ever occupied. The beast had stepped back because its oldest biological knowledge had looked at the human standing calmly in front of it and concluded, without reference to size or visible weaponry or any of the conventional threat indicators, that this was the wrong engagement, that whatever was standing there was not prey and was not obstacle and was not a predator to overwhelm, that it was, in the specific and ancient language of things that had learned survival before they learned anything else, the kind of thing you did not fight. The room was quiet for a long time. Kralais Vareth looked at Corvin Ash in the third row. He was writing in his notepad with the same small, dense handwriting he had used throughout. He did not appear to have registered the announcement as remarkable, which was itself a data point she was filing alongside everything else she had filed about him in the last 4 hours. "Your assessment," she said. It was the first thing she had said since the arena. He looked up. "Of which aspect? Of what this means?" He considered the question with the unhurried attention of someone who had been considering it since the moment Oreth took the step back. "It means," he said, "that your beast is functioning correctly. It means your genetic engineers did excellent work preserving the instinct architecture. It means the instinct architecture contains information about threat hierarchies that your doctrine of never retreating doesn't account for." He paused. "It means retreat is sometimes the correct output of a functional threat assessment, which is not a failure of the system, it's the system working." Kralais Vareth held his gaze across the distance of the observation tier. "And what does it mean," she said more quietly, "for the Empire's philosophy?" Corvin looked at what he had written in the last line of his notepad. "Completion as cultural value. Asymmetry between tactical flexibility and doctrinal rigidity. It means," he said, "that the philosophy was built without access to the complete dataset." He said it without judgment, with the tone of someone noting a methodological gap rather than a moral one. "You built a doctrine of never retreating because you had never encountered a context where retreat was the right answer. Your beast retreated because it had access to older data." He closed the notepad. "That's not a failure of your empire, your sovereignty. That's information." The room was quiet again. Kralais Vareth looked at him for a long moment with the four-spectral band vision that saw things human eyes couldn't reach, and whatever she was seeing, it was making her expression do something that her protocol staff clearly had no existing category for. "You walked into that arena," she said, "knowing what would happen." "I had a hypothesis," he said. "I wanted to test it." "That is," she said, "either the most reckless thing I have ever witnessed or the most confident." "In my experience," Corvin said, closing his notepad, "those are often the same thing depending on whether the hypothesis is correct." She looked at him for another moment. Then Kralais Vareth, sovereign of an empire built on the philosophy of never retreating, did something her protocol staff would spend the following weeks trying to correctly classify in the diplomatic record. She inclined her head, not the full formal acknowledgement reserved for equals, but something in the same structural family, something that communicated a recalibration of category. "You are," she said, "not what I prepared for." "No," Corvin agreed, "we rarely are." Outside the arena, Oreth was being returned to its housing by handlers who were still running diagnostics on systems that had performed exactly as intended and produced an output no one had anticipated. The control system's retreat indicator had been logged, time-stamped, and flagged for review by engineers who were going to have a great deal to think about. In the third row, Corvin opened his notepad to a new page and began writing the follow-up notes. The most interesting data, in his experience, always arrived after you stopped looking for it.